Chakara karmanyati purushani yanishvara kirtaya tani mahyam sa vishvajanma sthiti samyamarthe kritavatara pragrihita shakti Chakara karmanyati purushani yanishvara kirtaya tani mahyam sa vishvajanma sthiti samyamarthe kritavatara pragrihita shakti Chakara karmanyati purushani yanishvara kirtaya tani mahyam sa vishvajanma sthiti samyamarthe Tavatara pragrihita shakti Chakara karmanati purushani yanishvara kirtaya tani mahyam sa vishvajanma sthiti samyamarthe Kritavatara pragrihita sakti Chakara karmanati purushani yanishvara kirtaya tani mahyam sa vishvajanma sthiti samyamarthe Kritavatara pragrihita shakti Chakara karmanati purushani ya vishvanahita yanitnani mahyam sa vishvajanma sthiti samyamarthe Kritavatara pragrihita shakti Chakara karmanyati purushani yanishvara kirtaya tani mahyam Saha, the personality of Godhead. Vishva, universe. Janma, creation. Sthiti, maintenance. Samyama arthe, with a view to perfect control. Krita, accepted. Avataraha, incarnation. Pragrihita, accomplished with. Shaktihi, potency. Chakara, performed. Karmani, transcendental activities. Ati purushani, superhuman. Yani, all those. Ishvaraha, the Lord. Kirtaya, please chant. Tani, all those. Mahyam, unto me. Translation. Kindly chant all those superhuman transcendental activities of the Supreme Controller, the personality of Godhead, who accepted incarnations fully equipped with all potency for the full manifestation and maintenance of the cosmic creation. Purport. Vidura was undoubtedly very eager to hear about Lord Krishna in particular, but he was overwhelmed because Lord Krishna had just passed away from the visible world. He therefore wanted to hear about him in his Purush incarnations, which he manifests with full potencies for the creation and maintenance of the cosmic world. The activities of the Purusha incarnations are but an extension of the activities of the Lord. This hint was given by Vidura to Maitreya because Maitreya could not decide which part of the activities of the Lord Krishna should be chanted. And again the translation. kindly chant all those superhuman transcendental activities of the Supreme Controller, the personality of Godhead, who accepted incarnations fully equipped with all potency for the full manifestation and maintenance of the cosmic creation. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Om Jnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupah Kadamahyam Dadhati Svapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yutapada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Saji Jivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jigatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gauratashe Namaha Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So we're hearing now of Vidura's questions to Maitreya, which of course begin most of the discourses in Srimad Bhagavatam. There's always that nice format of question and answer. It's in the format of the Samvad, as we hear in Bhagavad Gita. And Vidura, he's asking somewhat peculiar questions, because we would expect him to be asking about Krishna directly. He is feeling that separation, that anxiety, that all of the devotees felt upon Krishna's disappearance from the world. And yet he's asking all of these other questions. He's asking about Varnashram. He's asking about the Purusha avatars. He's asking about all sorts of things. And the Purusha avatars are actually the concluding question he asks. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he says that the reason for this is because there is a principle in logic that we should end always with the sweetest things. So the pastimes of the Lord are much, much sweeter than topics of Varnashram and so on and so forth. So in accordance with this principle, he has asked about the nature and activities of the Lord. But we can still wonder why he's doing this. It seems a little out of the blue. And of course, Srila Prabhupada's given a very nice explanation. I was speaking to Nrsimha Kavacha Prabhu about this as well. And he was saying another reason why Vidura is asking so indirectly is he's actually trying to needle out to see if Maitreya is actually qualified to speak these things. So he's asking these lesser questions to sort of check out his degree of qualification in speaking, to see whether he knows these things, whether he fully understands these things, which is, of course, a great principle always to have in regards to being discriminatory in one's hearing and understanding. So, what is he asking about? He's asking about the Purusha avatars. And as we know, the Purusha avatars, they're threefold. We find they exist almost entirely for the maintenance of the material world. They are the bridge, if you will, between the spiritual and material worlds in terms of expressing Krishna's authority and power. And often we can hear many different religions. They'll describe God, the divine, something or another like this. But when they use this word God, what do they refer to? This is something of an interesting question, especially when we see the way that Srila Prabhupada utilizes and implements language. Because when we see the Purusha avatars, we see what most people normally refer to as God. When people use this word God, they're referring to this sort of figure, transcendentally situated in this material world, but still situated, or rather this material world is transcendently situated upon them. They're the foundation, and they're present everywhere, and they're maintaining everything. Vishnu, the all-pervading one, present everywhere. So this is the standard idea of God that we'll find throughout all sorts of traditions. When Bhakti Hriday Bon Maharaj, the disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, we know he somewhat famously traveled around Europe preaching. And he went around in all sorts of countries. He went to Germany, he went to England. That's where we find the first Gauriya Vaishnava temple established outside of India. Was established in England during Bon Maharaj's travels there. By and large, they weren't the most successful preaching missions, but still, he went out. And when he returned, he had many stories that the members of the Gauriya Math, they sort of relished. Bhakti Vikas Maharaj, he was relaying the story because, of course, he had a lot of contact with the Gauriya Math while researching his book, Bhakti Siddhanta. How does it go? Bhakti Siddhanta Vilas. Vaibhav, that's it, yeah. So, while researching this book, he had a lot of encounters. And he recounts that after Bon Maharaj returned, he had attended a theistic play while in Europe. And this theistic play was rather interesting to Bon Maharaj and the source of a lot of amusement from the other members of the Gauriya Math, all of his godbrothers. And in this play, there's some sort of events happening, and eventually God appears. And God appears in this play. And when he appears as this old man with a big beard. He's got this big beard and he's very, very old. He can hardly move. And this is the all-powerful God. And so all of the members, all of his godbrothers, they had a lot of amusement from this. It's a very interesting conception. How you can go from a very youthful cowherd boy to a very, very old man. And the whole idea they have behind that is God is very, very old. He is an Adir, Govindaha. He's Sarva Karana Karanam. And in order to do all of those things, he must be very, very ancient. However, this logic doesn't really hold up too well. Because we can think, yes, in order for something to be ancient, it might look old. Right? That does kind of make sense. That a very, very ancient being would be very, very old. But the thing is, something that's older than an elderly man is a dead man. If they wanted to show that God is very, very old, and doing that by showing the decay of the material body, then it would make much more sense that they would have shown a coffin or something like that. But then they would have no God at all. So this whole conception, it's very humorous when one has a more complete understanding. So, actually, the infinitely old idea of divinity would be an infinitely useful idea. Because only an infinitely useful personality could exist eternally. If there was a limit to the youth of a personality, then eventually they will decay away, as this apparent Purush, as this apparent God of this play did. So, instead, there is a different understanding of this word God than is often seen. And actually, this tradition of God being an old man is very, very old in the Middle East and Abrahamic religions. We know that the Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, they tend not to like to depict God. They see it as a bad thing. The Christians, especially the Catholics, are a little softer on it. But definitely Muslims and Jews, right? Muslims don't even like to depict their prophets. Forget about God. But this is actually a more modern development. Through archaeology, we found that historically they did have like these sort of murtis of all sorts of gods. They weren't monotheists at the time. They were all demigod worshippers. So they had all of these murtis of all the different demigods. And they also had a murti of the king of all of them, who was El. That was his name. And in it, he was, we found in excavations, he was an old man who put his hand out to give blessings. Which is, of course, still the standard understanding. I found that rather interesting. That even after this image, this murti had been forgotten completely in the mind still this subconscious impression of this old man who's there to give us blessings. We know Srila Prabhupada, he wasn't so much of a fan of this mindset of give us this day our daily bread, in the sense that we're using God as a source to serve us. So, this mindset is there. And this is one sort of perception, one sort of understanding of God. But this is, again, not our conception. This is not our understanding. And Srila Prabhupada has very nicely conveyed this. If you read Tamal Krishna Goswami's PhD, A Living Theology of Krishna Bhakti, it's very interesting because Tamal Krishna Goswami, he analyzes the contribution of Srila Prabhupada. He analyzes what Srila Prabhupada was doing. A living theology, meaning that bhakti as a living practice was being translated from one context to another. Srila Prabhupada was translating the beliefs and theology of Gauriya Vaishnavism from an Indian context into an international one. And in doing this analysis, he said there are two central Mahavakyas of Srila Prabhupada. There are two central principles. We know the Mahavakyas, especially the Mayavadis, they're very fond of this concept because it allows them to take one principle and then subvert all of the clear statements of Shastra into service of their somewhat unclear principles. We know Mahaprabhu, he was very critical of this. We read in Chaitanya Charitamrita. The real Mahavakya is the Om syllable, right? It's not all of these other Mahavakyas that they proposed in order to subvert the direct meaning of Shastra. So we know they're very fond of it, but it's not necessarily a principle that's belonging to the monopoly of the Mayavadis. As we know, Mahaprabhu then later said there is a Mahavakya, right? So Tamal Krishna Goswami, he used this whole system of the Mahavakya and he based it on Mimamsa principles for interpreting Srila Prabhupada's contribution, for interpreting Srila Prabhupada's thought. And so he came down to two Mahavakyas. Does anyone want to guess what one of those was? Yes, Supreme Personality of Godhead is one. Do you want to guess what the second one was? Yes, the devotional service. That was the second one. These two statements are like the central principles which Srila Prabhupada constantly holds as like the focal points by which everything else is interpreted. And there's a very significant, there's a great significance to why. Srila Prabhupada very easily could have gotten away with saying God, but he chose not to. So there's some significance in him saying the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Also, and a little out of the scope, I might touch on it a little later in the class, but devotional service as well. He could have just translated it as devotion. This was what everyone else was translating it as. But there was something very intentional. Srila Prabhupada's translations, sometimes they're not so literal. We'll find in 7th canto, I think it's Prahlad Maharaj, he starts mentioning movie songs. Songs from movies, right? Which I doubt was there in Satya Yuga. So Srila Prabhupada, sometimes he will use a not so literal a translation in order to convey a precise point that he wished to convey. So devotional service, Supreme Personality of Godhead, these statements are like this. Srila Prabhupada is adding terms, not inaccurate terms, but he is fleshing out these concepts in order to make points. And this word is used a lot by Srila Prabhupada. In that book, Tamal Krishna Goswami actually went through and he found that Srila Prabhupada, at the very least, used the phrase Supreme Personality of Godhead 7,926 times. And that's the minimum amount. That's the bare minimum amount of times that this phrase Supreme Personality of Godhead has been utilized by Srila Prabhupada. I was going to, but I didn't get around to it. I was going to go through Vedabase and find how many hits I found for devotional service. I'm sure that also would be very much in the thousands. So these phrases are very, very intentional. And if we try and find them in previous English usage, and if we find previous English usage, we're pretty much looking at Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he used English, but not as much. Not as much as Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada. He used English a lot. And we find similar phrases, but we don't exactly find Supreme Personality of Godhead. And we don't find them to the degree of being used nearly 8,000 times. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he said things like, Krishna is the transcendental personality of Godhead. He's also recorded as having saying Krishna is the personality of the transcendental absolute. And in one point he says Krishna is supreme Godhead. So we find this word Godhead seems to be very much born with the mind of Srila Saraswati Thakur. But supreme personality of Godhead, this is a specific contribution of Srila Prabhupada. So, Srila Prabhupada, he has rendered this term, Krishna, the supreme personality of Godhead. And there's a very specific point being made here. Because if Krishna was just his Purusha avatars, if the Purusha avatars were the ultimate concern, the ultimate consideration, then the word God might be appropriate. It might be sufficient, because that carries all of the baggage that we carry with the word God, the supreme controller. But this is not the limit of the Gauriya Vaishnava Siddhanta. We know in the Rai Ramananda Samvad, what is the first answer that Rai Ramananda gives as to what is the goal of life? He quotes he quotes that text, Vishnur Aradhatam, I'm forgetting how the rest goes now, Pantha, Vishnur Aradhatam Pantha, and then it ends some other way. The only way to please Vishnu is through the execution of one's dharma, one's varnashrama duties, one's duties to society. This is how Rai Ramananda, he answers the question, what is the ultimate goal of life? And we know what Mahaprabhu had to say about that. Eho basho, age koho ar. This is external, please go further. So what's interesting in this text is he doesn't say Krishna is pleased. We haven't even gotten to the point of Krishna yet. What we found here is a mentioning of Vishnu, both in the Bengali answer and in the shloka that is quoted to back it up. Vishnu is who is pleased by the execution of this varnashram. So this very, very, very external aspect, that is what pleases Vishnu. It doesn't even touch onto Krishna. Again, because Vishnu is the one who is situated here and doing all those sort of things which the idea of God so much is attached to. Which is why we find in most conceptions, Zoroastrianism, again Judaism, Christianity, although there can be an argument the other religions got it all from Zoroastrianism, but we still find this idea that after you die, God will bring judgment. Judgment Day is the focal meditation of all of these traditions. Judaism is waiting for it. In Christianity, there's this big idea of having your sins forgiven. Why? Not for freedom now, but so that on Judgment Day, you're not really going to, cop it. In Islam as well, if you read the Quran, every few passages, there's a mention of Judgment Day. Beware, Judgment Day is coming soon. Stuff like this. This is the central idea. Because again, being a good person, a moral consideration, piety and impiety, these are considerations which are pleasing to Vishnu, as we can see in the Rai Ramananda Samvad. Which is why, again, this word God correlates well to Vishnu. But what does Mahaprabhu say? This is only external. Go deeper. So if we go deeper, deeper beyond this understanding of God, if you will, then we can come to something like Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Because we understand it sometimes. Of course, Srila Prabhupada does say Krishna is God. And this is an appropriate thing to say. But Srila Prabhupada, again, 8,000 times, he has said Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. There's something much beyond this conception of God. We can say God is an incarnation of Krishna. Krishna is not a form of God. Krishna is not the form of God. God is a form, an expansion of Krishna. Krishna is Godhead. Something much beyond what we understand as God. The limits of this term God are too limited to encapsulate Krishna. But Supreme Personality of Godhead, this is a term now which can better demarcate exactly what Krishna is. And Tamal Krishna Goswami, he writes some very sweet realizations actually in his PhD. It's very nice to see, because obviously at university I read a lot of academic stuff and it's dry and boring and it's not very nectarian. But it was so nice to read Tamal Krishna Goswami's writings. Even in academic language, he was so very beautifully glorifying Srila Prabhupada and Srila Prabhupada's books. So he writes these very sweet meditations on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And I won't get into them because they're actually very technical at one point. But he writes this interesting point, that Supreme Personality of Godhead, he writes many points on why it is such a important term, on why it actually captures so much of Srila Prabhupada's message. If we find these terms, devotional service and Supreme Personality of Godhead, and put them together, there we find it. There we find the encapsulation of Srila Prabhupada's message. We find Bhagavan and we find Bhakti. And then, of course, in devotional service, there is implied the Bhakta, and then what else is there? This is the Sambandha, Abhidheya, and Prayojana. And that's actually how the book's laid out. So, this term, Supreme Personality of Godhead, has the tension which Krishna embodies. Because we find supreme, we find all of the notions of otherness beyond the supreme, so far away from us who most of us can, we can very much experience that we're not the supreme. Especially in this Corona era. It's been very, how to put it, I won't talk about Corona because it comes up in every Bhagavatam class these days, but it's been very humbling in the sense that it's made people realize they're not the supreme. But the Supreme is very other, it's very distant. And maybe Supreme can be used very well to describe the Purusha avatars. But Krishna in his fullness, as we know when we reach the end of the first question of the Rai Ramananda Samvad, he is not supreme and distant, he is supreme and close. He is supreme in intimacy. And therefore we have personality. Because personalities are something that are very, very easily available to us. Personalities are something that are intimate. Personalities are something that are close. And in this tension of the word supreme, personality, and then of course Godhead, to let us know that this is something beyond God that is being described. In these terms, we find a very nice encapsulation of what Krishna is. Because Krishna is not supremely divorced from his devotees. It is not that he stands on a throne, very, very high up, and people can only very barely see his glow, and then they worship him from below, because then he would be the supreme Godhead. But no, he is fully transcendental and he's all those things, but he climbs off his throne and then plays with all of his devotees. And therefore he is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And we find this throughout the pastimes of Krishna. All over Krishna book, especially if we relish. We find this. Krishna is what? He's wrestling with his friends and they are winning. Here is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So, like this, we can understand Krishna is something beyond God. These Purusha avatars, they're very significant. But Krishna is beyond them. And how is Krishna beyond them? Even, we can say, Narayan. Narayan, who is not even Krishna in his fullest, right? Even Narayan is beyond these three Purusha avatars. This word Nara, or Nara, is actually one of the other names. All three of them, they're sometimes called the three Naras. So Narayan is the shelter of the three Naras. So this is how the name Narayan is attributed to Krishna. This is how the name Narayan is a name attributed to an expansion of Krishna. Because Krishna is again the shelter of the three Naras. So we can find here, linguistically, that Krishna is the source, he is supreme over these Purusha avatars. But furthermore, we can also find that Krishna is supreme, again, because he is infinitely sweeter than all of them. And then, of course, we come to the famous pastime. Even though it's in the end of the 10th canto, it's actually happened before the Battle of Kurukshetra. Because we know all of the Brahmins, they were all debating, they were all discussing, they were all wondering who is supreme. Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, who is the most supreme? And then of course they came to the conclusion that Vishnu is the most supreme. But Shukadev Goswami, he did not want to bewilder, he did not want to divert people's attentions into being confused that Vishnu is supreme over Krishna. And so then he speaks this pastime at the very end, because Bhagavatam ends, 10th canto ends not chronologically, but ends with the glorification of Krishna. So even though this pastime happened before the Battle of Kurukshetra, it is described here at the end of the 10th canto. And we find that in Dwarka, there was a Brahmin. We all know it's a very famous pastime. And this Brahmin, he was having a child. And the child, the moment it hit the floor, what happened? The child died, right? So this Brahmin was very, very upset. And he took the body and he threw it at the, didn't throw it, he placed it at the court of Ugrasena. And he began, very angrily to chastise. He was duplicitous, greedy, envious enemy of the Brahmins, because he is so unqualified and addicted to sense gratification. This is the reason why my child has died. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, because the Brahmin thought, I've done no sin, then therefore the only natural conclusion is that the king is guilty. And this is a very proper Vedic conception. It's described in A Miracle on Second Avenue. That Srila Prabhupada was once told, there was this photo, I think of Indira Gandhi, and she was getting attacked by a mob, right? And the mob was attacking her because of droughts. And the disciples of Srila Prabhupada brought this story to Srila Prabhupada, and they're saying, look what's happening in India, all of this, and they're expecting, Srila Prabhupada to say, this is how terrible society has gotten. But Srila Prabhupada, he actually said, this is good. This is good. And they were all confused, all the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. They're saying, how could this be good? This unrest. But Srila Prabhupada said, this shows they still have some remnants of the Vedic mindset, that they are thinking this drought is the fault of the ruler. Because this is the thought of Vedic times. Because the rulers held that responsibility. We find it mentioned in Hari Bhakti Vilas, that the sins of the wife, the husband will be responsible for. The sins of the citizens, the king is responsible for. And in the same way, the spiritual master takes responsibility over his disciples. And of course we hear in Perfect Questions, Perfect Answers, Srila Prabhupada echoes this sentiment by saying the spiritual master takes on the karmic reactions of the disciple. So we find in Hari Bhakti Vilas, this principle is there. It's expanded out everywhere, out to any position of responsibility really. So this is a very valid principle. The Brahmin was not incorrect in placing his frustrations at the king. If he truly was faultless, then we can say it is a Vedic principle to assume that it is the ruler's fault. Which is why we can see that things aren't so happy anywhere in the world, because all the rulers are practically demons. So he continued going, and then with all of the remaining children. So for years this would happen, second, third, and he's placing all of them. And every single time he said the same lament. He had the same frustration, the same agitation, the same worry. And then we know Arjuna with Krishna, he overhears this, and he asks him, what's the matter? Can't you find a single, lowly kshatriya in order to defend you, in order to hold your bow, in order to hold his bow and defend? Can you only find kshatriya bandhus? We know there's the dvija bandhu, the friend of the Brahmins, the friend of the twice-born. There's also the kshatriya bandhu, the friend of the kshatriyas, an imposter, an actor. Are they all just playing? He said, are all the kshatriyas just being Brahmins, so obsessed with all of their yagyas and other sacrificial acts? So, like this, we hear Arjuna, he says, don't worry, I will protect you. And if I can't, I will dive deep into the flames. I will dive into the fire. I will give up my life out of shame. As we know in Bhagavad Gita, for a righteous person, infamy is worse than death. And then of course the Brahmin, he says, I can't really take you seriously. Sankarshan, Aniruddha, Vasudev, Pradyumna, none of them could protect my children. How can you? On the topic of Sankarshan, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha, it's said in Shastra actually, even though we'll find their names are sometimes used interchangeably, it's very confusing. Sometimes the names, in referring to the Chaturvyuha, sometimes they use different names to refer to the different personalities, because it's just the fun of studying Shastra. But one thing that's interesting is Sankarshan, actually, he is the source of the first Purusha avatar. Pradyumna is the source of the second, and Aniruddha is the source of the third. So they all expand out from the Chaturvyuha. They all expand out from these personalities. Sometimes we'll find different descriptions in Shastra, because, again, Shastra sometimes uses the names interchangeably. But in Laghu Bhagavatamrita, either Gopi Pranadhana Prabhu or Jiva Goswami makes the point that actually, in the proper conception, in the highest conception, it is Sankarshan who is the source of the first Purushavatar, Pradyumna who is the source of the second, and Aniruddha who is the source of the third. So, in this way, he says, none of these personalities, none of them were able to protect my child, What are you saying? That you can protect my children when all of those, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Chaturvyuha themselves, could not? So who are you? And Arjuna then, he replies, he says, I'm none of them. I'm neither Krishna nor Krishna's son. But I'm Arjuna, the wielder of the Gandiva bow. And it said, at that point, when he said the Gandiva bow, he pointed at the bow. The Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur includes all of these interesting sort of details in the pastimes. Actually, one you'll find commonly is who's pointing at who. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he sort of makes the pastimes act out like a play sometimes to help you sort of visualize. So he'll describe who was pointing at what were they doing when they were saying all of these things. So yeah, he says that when Arjuna holds up his bow, and says, I'm Arjuna, the wielder of the Gandiva bow, he points at it in order to make the point. This very bow. This is the one. So Arjuna then, it's described there were two options. Either Arjuna stayed for a year in Dwarka, or he left and made sure to come back in time for a year. But Srila Prabhupada in Krishna book, he takes the opinion, and of course that's the opinion that we'll take, is that Arjuna stayed for the whole year in Dwarka. So Arjuna, he stays the whole time. And then of course, now the baby's about to be born. And so the wife of the Brahmin, she says, call out for Arjuna. And so the Brahmin, he rushes to Arjuna. And we know Arjuna, he prepares himself. And what does he do? He prays to Shiva. And there's a few reasons given why he prays to Shiva. One is that Krishna, he had not been able to protect these babies. So Arjuna thinks I'm better off trying Shiva this time around. So that's one reason that's given. Another that's given is because the Brahmin was there, he had already blasphemed Krishna a bit. So Arjuna, being a friend of Krishna, he felt a little uncomfortable asking Krishna for protection. After the Brahmin had said these harsh words, Arjuna thought, it just feels a little wrong now to ask for Krishna's help. Krishna might be God and all that, but he's also my friend. More importantly, he's my friend. I couldn't do that. And the other one is that, as we know, Arjuna's not too successful. The other explanations they're given is Arjuna did this in order to make the point that not even Shiva can give protection if Krishna wants to do something. Not even Shiva can get in the way. Shiva, we know, is such a great personality. Not even Shiva can get in the way of Krishna's desire. So these are the three reasons given, because it's a little peculiar when Arjuna starts praying to Shiva instead of Krishna with no point. Why does he pray to Shiva then? So we know why he hasn't prayed to Krishna, but why does he pray to Shiva? We know that Shiva, he taught him how to use the Pashupata weapon after Arjuna impressed him very much. So in a sense, Shiva is one of Arjuna's gurus. So he prayed to Shiva thinking, this is a guru of mine, so I will take his blessings. And we know, as the baby is getting born, Arjuna, he fires his arrows everywhere and he forms a big fence around. So there's no way the baby could be taken. There's no one who could take the baby. But then instead, we know the baby disappears into thin air. Completely vanishes. And there we see, even the blessings of Shiva, even the great military powers of Arjuna, they could not protect the baby. The baby just disappeared into thin air. If that is required in order for Krishna to have his will done, then it'll happen. And of course, this is also then encouraging to the devotees, because if we can understand that not even Shiva, such a powerful personality, not even Arjuna can get in the way of Krishna's desire, then so long as we are serving Krishna, So long as our desire is Krishna's desire, which is a big if, it's a little hard to get to that platform, but so long as we can be confident that what we're doing is Krishna's desire, so long as we can be confident that at the very least we're trying to please Krishna, to perform his desire, that our desires are in line with his, then there shouldn't be so much anxiety. Because again, if Arjuna couldn't get in the way of Krishna's desire, if Shiva couldn't get in the way, then what are all the other obstacles? What to speak? So this is the purport, if you will, of Arjuna going all the way to show this. It's showing how powerful is Krishna. And we'll hear a little later on in the pastime how that power is utilized by Krishna. So then, at this point, the Brahmin speaks very heavy words, and he says it in the presence of Krishna. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he makes a very funny point on this. He says that the reason why the Brahmin said it instantly in front of Krishna is he actually had more pleasure if he could say it in front of other people than if he would have said it on his own. The Brahmin was getting a better kick out of insulting Arjuna in front of an audience than if he would have just insulted Arjuna on his own. Because he's thinking, now I'll get people to all join in on hearing my chastisement of Arjuna. So he says, why did I believe the bragging of this eunuch? To us, I think with a bit of a cultural distance, the insults seem they fall a little flat. But in a Vedic context, he was, on fire. He was absolutely destroying Arjuna, right? He had him good. So he said all of these, insults, this bragging eunuch, he thought he could do what the Supreme Lord couldn't, and now see, he is useless. And Arjuna, now he's thinking, bit by bit, the fire is getting closer, in his mind. So he's going, and he begins to travel in all the directions it's described. Firstly, he goes to Samyamani, which is the domain of Yama. And he goes and he can't find the boy. So now he's confused, right? Well, did the boy die? Why isn't he here with in this domain? And then he goes, he can't find him anywhere. And he goes, and it's described in the Bhagavatam, he goes in every single direction except for northeast. In every direction he goes. And he goes to all of these places. We know in Krishna book, Prabhupada gives such a nice description of all of the places that he goes to. He goes to the domain of, he goes everywhere, right? It's a long list, yeah? Except for northeast. So he goes to all of these places and he couldn't find them. The reason why he doesn't go northeast is this is where Shiva was located in relation to him. And as we know, Arjuna had this nice relationship with Shiva, right? So he trusted Shiva as his guru because he had prayed, Shiva, please protect me, please empower me, please bless me in protecting this baby. He trusted Shiva as his guru, that Shiva wouldn't have been the one to have taken him. Because if Shiva would have been the one to have taken him, then that would have been a pretty bad guru-disciple relationship. So, because of this, he didn't go in that direction. He thought, why spend that time? Because it's not so easy to search the whole universe, right? So, like this, he searched, and he was pretty confident, look, that's it, can't find him. And so then at this point, Arjuna decides, okay, the fire had been creeping up in his mind, and now he thought, it's time to go in. And as he's about to do it, Krishna comes right at the last second. This is Krishna, the personality of Godhead. There's a very playful nature of Krishna. Krishna says, no, stop. I will show you where all of the children are. And you can just imagine what Arjuna was thinking. You knew all along. I traveled all around the universe, and you're telling me now, as I'm about to dive into this fire, you knew where it was. So I was saying earlier, Supreme Personality of Godhead. The supreme part is that he knew where the children were, and personality was he decided to save it until Arjuna was about to die. So here we find Supreme Personality of Godhead. And so he says, okay, let's go. And they hop onto the chariot, and they go, and they, we all know, they go past all of the, all the 7 dweeps. And of course, if we could tangent into Vedic cosmology, but we won't. So they go past all of them, and then they go past Loka. And we know past Loka, it gets a little dark. And so there was complete darkness. And we know Prabhupada, he very nicely paraphrases Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentary in saying that the horses, Krishna's horses, they begin to become bewildered, afraid. They're immersed in darkness. They don't know where to go. But actually they do know where to go, because the horses, they also come down from the spiritual world, right? Krishna, he has come from the spiritual world, so have his horses. So in the same way that Krishna, it's said by Sanatana Goswami, that Krishna is the greatest of all devas, because the word deva means that personality who is enjoying pastimes. And that's why all the demigods, they're always doing things, you know. They're always doing this and that, you know. They're always having fun. Whenever we hear, you know, they're going to the heavenly planets, they're always doing some sort of pastime, right? There's always people singing, Gandharvas singing, you know, people dancing, stuff like this, right? But who enjoys greater pastimes than Krishna? None of their pastimes compare. We know the most beautiful woman in the heavenly planets, the most beautiful woman on earth, it's said, is like a frog in the heavenly planets. But then the most beautiful woman in the heavenly planets is like a frog compared to the inhabitants of the spiritual world. We can understand there's this great development in beauty, right? So how can the pastimes of Krishna, how can they even be compared to the pastimes of the demigods? And therefore they are demigods, and Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, because he is Deva in the fullness of that word. So, we know Krishna likes to manifest pastimes, but so then do his associates who come down with him. So the horses, they were doing this in order to increase the relishability of this pastime, in order to increase attention, you know, in order to increase the fear of, oh no, we're out in the darkness, what's going to happen, you know, we're in very dangerous territory. In order to increase that mood, the horses appeared to be very confused and lost. And then we know Krishna, he launches out his Sudarshan chakra, and it enlightens everything, pierces through all of the layers of the cosmic egg, and then they go and they follow the direction of that light-giving Sudarshan chakra. And as they go through, they pass through the Brahma Jyoti. And passing through the Brahma Jyoti, we know, Arjuna, he becomes very, very blinded. When Nrsimha Kavach Prabhu, when he was staying with me, my light bulb in my bathroom broke. So I had to replace it. And Prabhu, he said, don't get one of these weak wattage ones. Get the highest wattage you can find, right? So I got the highest wattage ones I could find. And then when Nrsimha Kavach Prabhu went to brush his teeth at the end of the day, and he turned the light on, he was like, oh no, it's the Brahma Jyoti. Because of how bright it was. It's actually pretty blinding. I struggle a lot every day now, but what to do? But yeah, no, Nrsimha Kavach Prabhu, so every time he'd go to brush his teeth, he'd be like, then after then he would say, I'm about to enter into the Brahma Jyoti, Toshan Krsna. So yes, Arjuna, he was very much blinded by this Brahma Jyoti. And then, what's on the other end? On the other end, we find there the giant Anantashesh. Anantashesh is there, and we know Anantashesh is so glorious. My favorite glorification of Anantashesh is given by Vrindavan Das Thakur. In Chaitanya Bhagavat, he's describing the glories of Balaram, and of course Anantashesh is that expansion of Balaram. And he says the great glory of Anantashesh is that he's constantly speaking Krishna Katha with all of his 1,000 heads. So each one of his heads is a treasure chest holding within it the greatest treasure of them all. Krishna Katha, the qualities and glories of Krishna are all captured in each one of the mouths of Anantashesh. Which is why the spiritual master, the empowered representative of Krishna, is empowered by who? Is empowered by Balaram. So that same potency to speak Krishna Katha is there present in the spiritual master. Because Anantashesh, he has captured all of these wonderful qualities. This is how Vrindavan Das Thakur mentions it. He says in the form of Krishna Katha, but the actual words, he says is the qualities of Krishna are captured in the treasure chests of each one of Anantashesh's mouths. In the same way, the spiritual master has captured all those beautiful qualities of Krishna, and then he's pouring them forth. He's empowered by Balaram. And Balaram is none other than Anantashesh. So there, Anantashesh is there. They see Anantashesh. And then they see Mahavishnu. And Mahavishnu is very sweetly there, lying down. So beautiful. We hear the description. He is surrounded, by all of his various potencies. He's there with his beautiful, deep, blackish blue, his deep blue hue. He's wearing beautiful yellow garments. There's wonderful darshan. And then, before them, comes Krishna and Arjuna. And what does Krishna do? he gives his obeisances. He gives his humble obeisances onto the lotus feet of Vishnu. This is similar to how earlier in the Bhagavatam, Krishna, he gives his obeisances to Govardhan. And it's interesting, the word that's used in the shloka which describes Krishna giving obeisances to Mahavishnu is Achyutya. He's referred to as Achyutya, which we know means the infallible. So Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he gives a very interesting description. He says that the word Achyutya is used here in order to say that Krishna is Achyutya, but he is Achyutya in the fullest sense, in that he infallibly always plays the role of a cowherd boy. He always infallibly plays his role. He never breaks his role. He is infallible in his performance of his pastimes. And therefore, in order to infallibly perform his pastimes, he does a very human-like thing of paying obeisances to God, Mahavishnu. So like this, Krishna, he gives his obeisances unto Mahavishnu. And then, of course, Mahavishnu, he begins to smile. And there's a lot of attention brought onto the smile of Mahavishnu. He smiles, obviously, because now he's seen the reason why he stole all of these children. He wanted to have darshan of the Lord, right? He wanted to have darshan of Krishna. So he's smiling out of happiness. He's also smiling because he's smiling at what he's about to say. He's smiling, how clever is Krishna? Krishna is making me say these words which directly make it seem like I'm greater than Krishna, but indirectly reveal that Krishna is the greatest of all. So he's smiling at the cleverness of Krishna. And then he's also smiling because he's smiling at how confused Arjuna is going to be. He's smiling at how confused Arjuna is going to be after he sees all of this. And then he's lastly smiling because he knows that Krishna will clarify Arjuna's severe confusion. As we know, this is before the Battle of Kurukshetra, so Krishna will be addressing Arjuna's confusion a few times in their pastimes. So like this, he smiles, and we know he speaks. He says the most important part. I stole those children. Why did I steal them? I stole them because I wanted to see you. I wanted to see you, Krishna, and I wanted to see you, Arjuna. I wanted to see Krishna and his devotee. This is what I wanted to see. And then he speaks and he says, continue upholding dharma as Nara and Narayan. As we know, Nara and Narayan, it is not that Nara and Narayan become Arjuna and Krishna. We know that they are like Angshas, expansions of the two. Interesting, whenever Jiva Goswami talks about Nara and Narayan, in order to make the point, he will always say Narayan, I forgot the Sanskrit now, it's Narayan Narasakhaha. Narayan Narosakhaha, something like that. So he'll always say Narayan, the friend of Nara, in order to make it clear that Narayan is Vishnu Tattva and Nara is Jiva Tattva. So just interesting. I thought that was interesting. So he says, continue being like Nara and Narayan, maintain religious values, like this. He says all of this, and then the kids get sent back, Krishna and Arjuna, they go back the way they came, right? And they return the children, everyone's happy. Everyone except for Arjuna, who is very confused. Arjuna is very confused. He's thinking all sorts of questions. He's thinking, Vishnu, to quote that line from Rai Ramananda, Vishnu is most pleased by Varnashram. Why? He's the maintainer of the Brahmins. Why would he torment and torture a Brahmin like that? Then he thinks, but Vishnu, why would he want to see one of his forms? Why would he want to see an incarnation of his? Maybe it's just a fleeting desire he had. But no. And then there's an analysis of the term that he uses. It means perpetually. So Vishnu actually has the perpetual desire to have darshan of Krishna. So the word he used implies that he was perpetually desirous to see Krishna. This is all very confusing. So, like this. Like this, Arjuna, he's wondering many things. And this pastime is very confusing to him. And so, Krishna, knowing what Arjuna's problem was, he addressed this. And he told Arjuna, he said, Arjuna, He stole those children of the Brahmin because he knew, or at least he thought, that Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, would not be able to see the torture of a Brahmin. Krishna has the Brahmin so close to his heart, and therefore, if he steals a child of a Brahmin, he will have the highest chance of me going there in order to see him. This is what he thought. But this is actually not the fullest conception. I did not go, actually, in order to appease the Brahmin. If I would have gone to appease the Brahmin, I would have gone to Mahavishnu after he stole the first child. But I didn't go then. Actually, the reason why I went is because you were about to dive into the fire. Because you were about to give your life. Because you had given the vow that you would bring back these children. This is why I waited until the 9th child. So actually, I did all of this not in service to the Brahmin and not in service to Mahavishnu. I did all of this in service to my devotee. Had I gone earlier, it would have been service to the Brahmin. So Mahavishnu, again, he's very concerned with the ways this world works. Which is why he thought, the Brahmin, this is the height of what I can steal. This is the height of what I can steal from. But Krishna, he said, actually, the thing which causes me to go wherever I go is my devotee. So, to come back to the earlier point, nothing can stop Krishna, Krishna's purposes, Krishna's desires. Nothing can get in the way of them. And what are those desires all expressed in? They're all expressed in serving his devotees. So Krishna's omnipotence, Krishna's supremacy, Krishna the Supreme Personality of Godhead, by the aspect of him being a personality, and being so very favorable to his devotees. Those two work together in great harmony in that sense. The supremacy of Krishna makes his personality a great benediction to all of his devotees. And therefore also, how then can we please Krishna? We know it is by pleasing his devotees. So here we find, in this pastime it's very clear, why would Mahavishnu want to see Krishna if Krishna is not more complete, more beautiful, more full than him? Again, because Mahavishnu might be God. And in a sense, he is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Prabhupada does use that word. But the fullness of this term, the necessity of this term, is found in Krishna. Therefore, Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who God himself, God who Mahavishnu is, wants to see. Something beyond God. And there we can understand that God himself is just but a form of Krishna. Krishna is not just God. He is much, much more than God in what we mean by the word God, which is why we have again that wonderful Mahavakya of Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, that infinitely sweet personality. And I'll conclude with one point, an interesting saying I found. I was going through, there's the Hadith literature in Islam, right? And there's two categories of Hadith. There are ones which are said in the first person, so they're meant to be sayings that God said, and there's sayings that are spoken about God by Muhammad, right? Hazrat Muhammad. So the first person ones are ones of God describing himself. And in it, it says that God, he had meditated. He had thought, I am a hidden treasure. I'm an unknown treasure, but I desire to be known. And therefore, I created everything that exists. And I thought this was actually a very proper point. We find similar sentiments in the Vedic literature. That Krishna, he is this treasure, he is this beauty. This is why he is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He is a beauty that desires to be known by his devotees and to be known by others. Of course, there is no point where Krishna created everything. Everything's eternally existed. But it eternally exists in order to appreciate and facilitate